This is Free to Exchange, the show where free markets and free-thinking scholars meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. On today's show, we're going to discuss controversial aspects of business in America. We'll start by examining practices of big business. Are big businesses paying their CEOs too much? Is big tech evil? How about Wall Street? These are just some of the questions we'll ask on the first half of the show. Then on the second half of the show, we'll turn to the much maligned payday lenders. Are they charging outrageous prices or providing valuable services? My first guest is Professor Tyler Cowen. Dr. Cowen is the Holbert Harris Chair of Economics at George Mason University, where he also serves as the chairman and faculty director of the Mercatus Center. He's co-author of the leading economics blog, Marginal Revolution, a Bloomberg columnist, and author of several best-selling books. He's here today to discuss his latest book, Big Business, A Love Letter to an American Anti-Hero. Tyler, welcome to Texas and to the show.
Thank you, Ben.
So let's start with a broad question, a love letter to big business. Why?
Americans have gone crazy against big business. You see this in the presidential campaigns. You have Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, basically embracing socialism, talking about taxing American business much more, breaking it up, crippling it, regulating it in every way possible. It has now become a contrarian position to be for big business. So big business has become underrated. It pays higher wages, it innovates, it creates more jobs than ever before. American big business is the best in the world. It produces stuff for us. And I wrote a book laying out the basic facts about big business in this country.
So, well, big business, and that's a great start to a love letter, by the way. You had me at hello. But people point out lots of problems or things that they see as problems with big business where you disagree, I think, that these aren't necessarily so. And one of them is they see CEOs getting rich. High pay for CEOs, and this was particularly, I think, distinguished after the financial crisis, where you had CEOs on Wall Street who got golden parachutes. People said, this is just not fair. But you think CEO pay isn't out of line, do you?
CEO pay has gone up roughly in lockstep with the stock market. And that makes perfect sense. If you're paying your CEOs with shares of the firm or options to get them to do the work and boost value, then to the extent the firms are worth more, the CEOs are paid more. There's nothing unusual about that. Whether it's fair or not is perhaps a separate question. It's ordinary economics of supply and demand, the proper incentives. There's plenty of evidence that when CEOs die because of an accident and it's a surprise, and then the value of the firm goes down, clearly CEOs are underpaid relative to the value they're bringing firms, at least on average. There are bad CEOs, there are overpaid CEOs, just as there are overpaid athletes and professors. That is a part of life. Yes, it is unfair. But when you ask which system of business selects for the best CEOs, I would say America's number one.
And while we've seen the CEO pay go up with the stock market, it's also been kind of changing characteristics that are required to be a good CEO. Is it more competitive or tougher than it was in the past?
It's much harder. You've got to be on social media in many cases. You need to deal with the government. You need to understand the whole global economy. So demand for the top CEOs is up a great amount. The number of people you can find who can do all of those things, plus manage the company, make good hiring decisions and so on, it's simply a very, very difficult job. Current America is the first time in history that the wealthiest people in a society have decided to work more rather than less. And that's part of what's going on with our CEOs.
So this is just a competitive market for a kind of almost winner-take-all type market.
That's correct, with a lot of particular mistakes. But you look at great CEOs, say at Microsoft, who've made the company worth a lot more, or at Apple, the value created there by good decisions simply is tremendous.
Now, you mentioned Microsoft now, and I don't want to go to tech quite yet, but thinking of your love letter is to big business.
Sure.
And when people hear big, everybody favors small business, it seems. But when they hear,
like barbecue joints, right? They're awesome, but they're small.
I love barbecue in West Texas. But when they hear big, they think monopoly, and that big business is getting more and more monopolized. It's these few big companies that are running things. How do you respond to that?
In almost every sector of the American economy, you have much more choice than you did 20 years ago. Partly that's because of the internet, partly that's due to globalization, right? I would say our healthcare sector is screwed up. That's an exception to this principle. There are monopolistic hospitals in many rural and even suburban areas. But for the most part, just how much choice, the overwhelming nature of the choice is more of an issue than monopoly per se. If you want, go to a dollar store, go to Walmart, Amazon, The level of prices, selection, diversity, again, something people hadn't even thought was possible 20 years ago.
Yeah, you say Amazon. I think a lot of people hear Amazon. They say, well, Amazon's getting so big, that's where I buy everything. I don't have a choice.
Amazon in virtually all retail markets but books is below 15%. It is a much smaller company than Walmart. I buy books on Amazon. So the same book that in a bookstore is $27, $28 on Amazon is $17 or $18. And I have free shipping with Prime. That's an incredible deal. I can buy close to any book in the world that way. Those low prices show every sign of persisting. That's what is good for consumers.
And you raise an interesting point in your book about competition for the consumer's dollars or the consumer's attention even, in how technology's changed to compete with products that don't even seem like a competitor to it, such as social media interacting with other forms of entertainment, right?
It's very tricky these days to figure out who is a competitor to what. So people look at Facebook and they think, well, Facebook has no competitors. It's just not true. I mean, one competitor to Facebook is, taking a nap. Competitor to Netflix is going to bed early. Fortnite competes with both of them. If you look at competition for your attention on the internet, that is an incredibly fierce market. And yes, Facebook and Google and Netflix and Twitter, they're all part of it. But none of them have anything close to a monopoly once you look at that broader picture.
And even within the narrower picture, it might be telling in the companies' names that you just said, listing Netflix among them, and what's happening in the evolution there of competition within the market versus for a market, right?
There are now so many streaming services, right? Started in the last year. Disney has one. There's Hulu. You can go to YouTube and watch videos for free. All of that, again, is much more competition.
So sometimes when people hear big tech, and you single big tech out in your book and ask, is big tech evil? Yeah. Which is really kind of provocative. And you start it with a quote from Google, something like, do no evil is Google's motto. Is that?
Don't be evil.
Don't be evil is Google's model. When people hear big tech, they start getting concerns about what they know about them as consumers.
Look, it depends on the company. Some of the companies, there are perfectly legitimate criticisms that can be made. But if you look at Google, for instance, or Google/Alphabet, the conglomerate, it gives you free search services, a search problem that no one thought could be solved before Google came along, and it works remarkably well. You have free Gmail if you want it. They have been a major driver of driverless cars, right? Which elderly people will find very useful once we make them a bit better and a bit safer. Google Maps is extremely useful, finding your way around almost anywhere in the world. That too is free. YouTube, phenomenal engine of education and learning. I put free economics videos on YouTube. I believe this program will go free on YouTube. Now look, are there legitimate criticisms of some Alphabet and Google products? Yes. Overall, is the bundle a significantly large plus for almost all of us? Of course.
But they take my information.
They hoard your information for the most part, as does Facebook. So if you subscribe to a newspaper, the New York Times, they actually sell your information, your name, your address, your phone number. They sell it as is. The major tech companies do not, in general, do that. So whether you like this or not, it's been going on for a long time. What the reality is, Facebook is outcompeting newspapers in some ways. Newspapers hate Facebook, and they spread around this story like Facebook sells your information. The newspapers are the ones who do it. Your credit bureau does it. I'm not saying that's exactly how it should be. In my view, it's not. But it's a long-standing problem. Big tech is not a unique villain in this. I do think we should rethink privacy in some ways.
So some people will point to Wall Street as the unique villain, and that big business on Wall Street is the problem. How do you respond to that?
The U.S. financial sector is the best in the world at allocating capital to new and growing endeavors. That is in part how we have so many wonderful tech companies that give us these useful and sometimes even free services. They were able to get the capital. They had the opportunity to take those chances. In Western Europe, there are not comparable opportunities, and capital markets and finance are one of the biggest reasons why. If you ask, was the U.S. financial sector partly at fault for the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, I would say absolutely yes. We should have had higher capital requirements. Keep in mind, our government at the same time was doing everything possible to goose up the real estate market. So that is an area where many parties were at fault. U.S. banks, definitely part of that, deserve to be condemned for it. But the overall picture of the U.S. financial sector is much more positive than people think.
So this has been very positive so far, but in our last couple of minutes here, what reservations do you have? In what ways even if big business in general is great for our lives, in what ways are you most concerned?
Well, look, in many companies, there is a lot of fraud. That's an absolutely correct criticism and genuine concern. But you need to put it into the broader context of how often is there fraud from human beings. So when workers apply for jobs, how often do they falsify their resumes? At a very high rate. Much less honest than, say, Walmart or Amazon is likely to be with you. If you ask basic question, well, the company Match.com, they've been accused of some misleading practices in getting people to sign up. They might be guilty, but my goodness, look at the rate at which people lie on their online profiles. So for the most part, big business is actually more honest than individual humans, I would say. Far from perfect. We should be concerned. We should crack down more on fraud. But again, when you're morally judging big business, you need to make a realistic comparison, not utopian pie in the sky.
The last few seconds then, what about when big business interacts with government and asking for favors?
I'm against pretty much all of that. I don't think we should have corporate welfare. Don't think we should have farm subsidies. I don't think Amazon should get a subsidy for relocating. But as a percentage of the overall American economy, trillions and trillions of dollars, it's just not that large. It is not our biggest problem. Our biggest problem is probably in the healthcare sector. We have a lot of very bad government subsidies, bad incentives there. But I think corporate welfare should be zero.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Ben.
Up next, need a quick loan? Who would you rather visit, Fat Tony or a payday lender? Stick around to find out how regulation could limit your choice.
This program is made possible in part by a grant from the Helen Jones Foundation, supporting education and the fine arts in keeping with the philosophy of Helen DeWitt Jones, who devoted her later life to sharing her wealth as a patron of philanthropic causes. The Helen Jones Foundation.
Founded in 2013, the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University promotes the teaching and study of free market economics. As part of our programming, we sponsor a public lecture series open to students, faculty, staff, and the general public in the Lubbock community. Often, the speakers in that series are the guests that you see right here on Free to Exchange. More information is available at www.fmi.ttu.edu or by email at free.market@ttu.edu. Welcome back. Joining me now is Professor Todd Zywicki. Professor Zywicki is the George Mason University Foundation Professor of Law at the Antonin Scalia School of Law. He's also a senior fellow at the Cato Institute and the former executive director of the GMU Law and Economics Center. Todd, welcome to Texas Tech and to the show.
Thanks. It's great to be here in West Texas.
All right. So we want to talk about payday loans today and payday lenders. But to start off with, how do these loans work? What goes into them? How are they different from other types of loans?
So payday loans is sort of a nickname for what the product is, which is the idea is it's a short-term loan, often for $300 or $500. It's and they call it a payday loan because usually it has about a 2-week span. So it's not literally a payday loan, but basically the idea is to tide you over to your next payday, at which point you're supposed to repay the whole loan, or as is often the case, people, if they don't have enough to pay the full amount due at that time, they'll roll it over for another 2 weeks or whatever the case may be.
And so how does you walk into one of these storefronts and what do you give them and get credit? How does it work?
Well, that's what's interesting about this, Ben, is it's very different from sort of a bank loan. And this is something that payday loan customers actually like, which is that they really just walk in. They do they don't use traditional credit scoring, but they've got other ways of figuring out whether or not you're likely to repay the loan, including trying to figure out whether you've defaulted on other payday loans. But what payday loan customers like about it is, even though it's expensive, what they like about it is it's fast. It's convenient. A lot of payday loan customers say, I go into a bank and I'm coming from the construction site, and everybody at the bank turns up their nose at me. People at payday loan companies treat me like I'm a valuable customer. And so you go in, they help you, they give you money that you can get in a hurry. You can get it on your lunch break and get back to work.
And you just basically write them a check and post-dated, or?
That's basically right. Yeah, it's write a check and then they hold the check till that date. Nowadays, they can also do it with an ACH. You can authorize an automatic withdrawal from your bank account. But that's basically the idea: is you essentially post-date the check and they hold it till the date that you agree that the check will be cashed.
Now, but a lot of politicians vilify these things. What's their complaint about them?
Well, their complaint is that they're expensive.
How expensive?
The typical rate is about, for $100, it's about for every $100 borrowed, you typically pay about $15. So people make this up into what they call the APR, which is pretty high for a short-term a loan.
15 doesn't sound like a lot, but if we turn this and you roll it over all year, effectively your interest rate would be astronomical.
It would be very, very high, yes, much higher than a credit card, for example. But at the same time, unlike a credit card, where if you miss a payment or you don't, or you essentially roll it over, interest continues to accrue. Here, you really just only owe the amount you originally borrowed, and you may end up defaulting. The default rates are very high, but it's not like when a credit card, when you get in trouble with interest just spiraling up and that sort of thing. But that's really the opposition: is that it's expensive. And it's really for people who are in dire straits, people who have lost. People who use payday loans are people essentially who either don't have a credit card or maxed out on their credit card, and they need access to short-term cash, and they have to pay a high price for it for various reasons.
So why is the price so high then? Why doesn't competition bring the prices down lower? Because I see payday lenders all over the place. It's a competitive industry, right?
It's an incredibly competitive industry, and there's a couple reasons. The first is that they compete on margins, not just on price, right? So payday lenders have very long hours, for example. Payday lenders have a substantial staff because the people expect to be able to get in and out very quickly and not have to wait to see somebody, that sort of thing. So the operating costs are high. To have long hours, a lot of convenient locations for people and that sort of thing. And the default rates are high. Default rates really are high. And so when economists have looked at this, what they have concluded is that even though the price is high, it's justified in light of the operating cost and the risk.
Precisely because the type of people who need these loans are bad credit risks.
That's right.
So some states have gone in regulating these and putting effectively a price control on them that caps the interest. What's the effect of putting? I mean, the obvious effect is the prices of these loans come down, but that's not going to be all that happens.
Yeah, and what really ends up happening is that the product gets wiped out, right? That it's really, as I said, you really do have to charge a high price in order to make a small loan. So the reality of a loan business, for example, is that it costs about the same to make a $300 or a $3,000 loan, right? It's not 10 times more expensive to make a $3,000 loan, but if you have a larger loan, all those fixed costs I talked about, the operating costs, can be spread over a larger loan amount. And so the measured APR seems smaller, even if the price is the same, because the costs are the same. And so what happens is if you limit the interest rate, the APR is the phrase they use, that basically says small loans can't be made. And that wipes out payday loans. What happens next? Well, the evidence is pretty clear. Bad things happen next, which is utility terminations go up, evictions go up, people use a lot more overdraft protection, people have to resort to pawn shops, which are also very expensive and of course require you to part with useful household goods. And so payday loans, it appears for most consumers, are the least bad alternative that these people have, because better alternatives like credit cards just really aren't available to them.
So let's bring this home here in Texas then, because I know we regulate this fairly lightly in Texas, but there's a neighbor in Arkansas that doesn't. What's the story that goes on with Texas and Arkansas?
Yeah, well, Texas basically has the economics of this right. Traditionally, Arkansas has always been famous for having very strict interest rate ceilings, what they call usury ceilings. And there's been some really clever economic studies done in Texarkana, where you could compare what's going on the Arkansas side of the line with the Texas side of the line. In Arkansas, because they had such strict interest rate ceilings, a lot of these small loan businesses didn't operate And so what would happen is you would see, in Texas, you'd see a car dealer and a furniture store and a personal finance company. And on the Arkansas side of the line, you'd see pawn shop, right? Mm-hmm. And we even see this today, which is that Arkansas consumers who want access to various loan products actually cross the state boundary and come to Texas to be able to get access to competitive loan products that are essentially outlawed in Arkansas.
You know, this won't come as a surprise to people in Lubbock, because Lubbock used to be a dry city for retail alcohol.
Exactly.
And if you drive the highway south of town, you can see all the strip malls set up that used to sell it. So people used to cross the border to get what was effectively prohibited here and bring it back, except now instead of liquor, it's loans.
That's right. And this is the real lesson that we take away from this, Ben, is you can get rid of the supply of credit, but you can't get rid of the demand. If you need $500 to fix your transmission so you can get to work on Monday, you need $500 whether you got it in the bank or not. If you need money for your kids' braces, if you have an emergency, if you have a medical bill that needs covered, you need money whether you have it in the bank or not, and whether or not you have a credit card or not. And so when people need money and the supply is taken away, people become creative. They cross state boundaries, they go online, and they do other things that are not as good as just a transparent market that allows people to compete and to find the products that are best useful for them.
So let's bring this up to the national stage now, because some politicians in the United States have proposed interest rate ceilings, not just for payday loans, but for credit cards and things that more of our viewers probably use. Right. What's the difference there? Is the effect pretty much the same?
Yes, and basically what you see is you can think of a loan. The interest rate on a loan is simply the price, right? And there's a supply and a demand for loan products, and you can think of it as being sort of like squeezing a balloon. There's a certain amount of air in the balloon. If you squeeze it here, it pops up here. So, for example, a lot of people think, oh, that's great, we're going to cap interest rates on credit cards. They don't think about what comes next. When we did that in the past, what happened, for example, was every credit card had an annual fee. And you just have to pay $40 to have a credit card, right? Which, of course, was much more harmful for low-income consumers than high-income consumers, right? You would see benefits disappear, right? Sort of frequent flyer miles, cash back, all that sort of stuff would likely disappear. And so credit cards for most people. And basically what you would end up having is people who revolve their balances, who don't pay their bill every month. Yeah, they'd get a pretty good deal if they still had a credit card. But the rest of us who do pay our balances would basically have to subsidize those people.
Well, I think you also said something. You said if they still have their credit card. Right. That's an important caveat, isn't it? Wouldn't people lose credit cards?
That's right. And we know this from history, which is that low-income people, higher risk people would lose access to credit cards. And we even saw this with some legislation that was passed following the financial crisis that limited the ability of credit card issuers to price risk. And what we saw was credit card ownership by low-income or higher-risk households dropped 11 percentage points. And you want to know why payday loans have grown so much in the period since the financial crisis? All those people, those millions of people who had credit cards, lost their credit cards, but still had a need for credit. And so payday loans is where they had to turn for an alternative.
And if we dial this back in history, when we had more substantial interest rate controls in the 1960s in the United States until there was some reform later in the 70s, right. There was another really awful alternative to being accessing credit at higher rates.
Yeah, and this is the point about people need credit. And so when we tried the experiment that Washington is talking about now of comprehensive limits on all types of credit, wiping out payday loans, wiping out installment loans, wiping out higher cost credit cards, what we saw was loan sharking. What we saw, and it's not just a matter of myth, right? It's not just The Sopranos on TV and The Godfather, right? I'll give you an example, Ben, which is in 1973, when Anthony Fat Tony Salerno, the head of the Genovese crime family, was indicted. He was indicted on 14 counts of loan sharking and 1 count of criminal solicitation to actually have somebody's legs broken. Fat Tony was running $80 million a day in his territory in New York City. That's about $464 million in today's dollars. Overall, the national loan sharking market back in the 1960s was estimated about $10 billion at that time, which is about $69 billion in today's dollars. And to give you a sense of that, that's twice the size of the entire payday loan market in the United States that they were running illegal loan sharking operations. And these guys were using violence. They were literally breaking legs to enforce their debts. And so economically informed, economically sensible consumer advocates realized at the time it's better to allow fair and free competition, even if prices are high, than it is to drive desperate American families into the arms of Fat Tony and the other leg breakers.
Makes a lot of sense to me, Todd. Thank you for joining today.
Thanks, Ben.
Do businesses sometimes take advantage of others to profit? Sure. But that's not predominantly how they make their profits. For the most part, businesses make their profits by creating goods and services that make our lives better. So when you see a businessman who's become rich, at least here in West Texas, maybe not in Washington, D.C., they've probably become rich by making your life better. When you see them, rather than scorn, you should appreciate and thank them. We'll see you next time.